Hi, I'm Caroline Shields, Associate Curator and Head of European Art at the Art Gallery of Ontario. I'm thrilled to take a deep dive into a brand new acquisition called Sunlight and Showers by Anna Boberg. It is on view at the AGO as of just a couple of months ago. And so after looking at it in the virtual realm together today, I am thrilled to invite you to come on into the AGO and see it in person. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge that the Art Gallery of Ontario operates on land that is Mississauga Anishinaabe territory. Toronto is governed by Treaty 13 between the Mississauga of the Credit and the Canadian government. It has also been occupied by other Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and Wendat confederacies. Since 1701, Toronto is governed by the Dish with One Spoon Treaty between the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, and allied nations to peaceably share and care for resources around the Great Lakes. Toronto is now home to a large, diverse urban Indigenous population and has always been a trading center for First Nations. All people living in Canada are treaty people, including those who came here as settlers, either in this generation or generations past. Those who are arrivants and those who came here involuntarily, particularly as a result of the transatlantic slave trade. As treaty people, we are all part of a treaty relationship based on the recognition of respect, cooperation, partnership, and Indigenous rights. I want to start off as well by acknowledging and thanking two incredible postdoc scholars who are named Isabel Gapp and Eva Mebius. Both of them are studying the work of Anna Boberg, an incredible artist who worked in Sweden and around the globe. She was exhibited around the globe right around the turn of the 20th century. It's thanks to Isabel and Eva that I have almost everything that I have to share with you today. And so I am deeply grateful to them as well for their for all of the conversations that we've had leading up to this acquisition and since bringing it here to Toronto. So to start off looking at this painting, I just want to say that it is very likely a springtime snow shower, and it's the late spring here in Toronto now. It is not very long ago that we were having several April snow showers, and that's the kind of snow shower that we're seeing here in this painting. Anna Boberg was a Swedish artist and an extensive traveler. She and her husband Ferdinand, who was an architect, made their way around the globe across Europe. They went to Israel, all different parts of the Mediterranean. And she really understood herself as a traveler and an explorer. When she and her husband visited the Lofoten Islands in the Norwegian Arctic on a vacation, she became completely entranced with this region and would actually spend the last 30 years of her life and her career painting the Lofoten Islands. So she dove deep into the region and its culture. And here we see herself with a easel rig that she designed herself in order to be able to paint in deep snow, and a humongous palette. But one of the things I really love about this photo of her is that we can see that it's self-staged. It has this drape of this white kind of cloth behind her. And this is the photo that she used frequently to promote herself and her work in international exhibitions. So she is thinking hard about how she's understood and seen by others as a painter who really kind of gets deep into the landscape that she's painting. So she first visited the Lofoten Islands in 1901, and at this time it would have taken 2 trains and a boat to get there. So while it was in the Norwegian Arctic, above the Arctic Circle, it was not, impossible to get to, and it was a thriving fishing village there. As of the 19th century, so only a few decades before her arrival, it had become a tourist destination. And there was also a very long-standing Indigenous presence of the Sami peoples who were being forced out around the time that Boberg was coming to the island by the tourism industry as well as the fishing industry. So she was so entranced by this island when she arrived that her husband actually built her a studio to live on the island. there's a story that when they very first arrived, she was so enamored that she actually sent her husband home, and she stayed put there past the duration of their planned vacation. She sent him back to Sweden to mail her more canvases. And so she came back and over and was afforded an unusual degree of independence as a woman in this period in the early 20th century, because she was able to go unattended and stay in this home that her husband had built for her. That's not something that we often associate with women, particularly women working in Europe around the turn of the 20th century. And so as a kind of entry point into this painting, I want to read at some length from a passage in Boberg's autobiography. So this is a kind of memoir-like book that she wrote several decades after executing this painting. And so the passage that I'm going to read is undated, it's not referring to this painting in particular, but it's incredibly evocative of this painting, and I think offers us kind of a nice portal or entry point into understanding it. And this passage was very generously translated for us by Eva Mebius. Boberg writes, "Defying the disagreeable conditions is worth the trouble, because it's simply wonderful to behold the water's evaporation glittering like ice as it rises above the dense fog, through which the sun's red disk glows rather than shines. Condensation and mist welter, becoming denser, then dispersing, then torn apart, all the while revealing new perspectives of moving sceneries. And if you're lucky, you might get to experience the fabled phantom of the sea." The flash fog had taken me by surprise, and I had just put out the oars to hurriedly make my way back to shore, when a large, contourless object that I glimpsed through the crystallized humidity of the atmosphere caught my attention. It tottered to and fro, vanished and reappeared, swelling out into a sailing ship of gigantic proportions right next to my tiny bark. It was indeed a sailing ship, but it was not of this world. Without a sound, it glided forward in the draft of the cursed breeze that forever fills its blood-red sails. The rigging was covered in a frozen cascade of long icicles. A cataract of ice rushed down the mast, overflowing the deck and cabins. From the railing, a magnificent icicle fringe dipped into the dark green reflection of the water. Thus, the Flying Dutchman of the polar seas glided past me in all its terrifying glory and disappeared into the fog. So she's evoking Richard Wagner, the German composer's opera, The Flying Dutchman, in that kind of haunting quality of this ghost ship. But what I really love about this passage is how it's both haunting poeticism to it, the way that she uses words, the way that she describes this ship of gigantic proportions floating in silently. And at the very same time, it is deeply about the atmosphere and the effects of the sensations of sitting in the water, in the Arctic water, while beholding this episode. And I think that duality precisely characterizes this painting as well. This painting is both very symbolic in the kind of art historical sense of the word, meaning a movement that happened across Europe and North America right around the 1890s, which was a kind of push against the Impressionist movement. Impressionism is so often about detailed, truthful, supposedly atmospheric observation. If you think about Monet's obsession with capturing the details of light on haystacks, for example, we see that kind of Impressionist observation both in this painting and in the passage that I just read. And at the same time, it's also a kind of push or counterbalance against that, where there's this kind of poeticism that's about something higher and perhaps even more spiritual, about another unearthly realm that she is tapping into. And those movements are so often counterposed, and yet both in this passage and in the painting, and in the way that Boberg understood herself, they are both a neither. It's both a neither Impressionist and symbolist. And she really kind of deftly defies those categories. That's part of the reason that Boberg was lost to art history for so long. Very often when artists don't fit neatly into one of our categories, they get written out of the history of art. And yet it's so interesting when artists refuse to fall into those categories. And that's one of the many reasons why this painting is so interesting and exciting for us as a new acquisition. So I want to take a moment to dive into the painting and look very closely at it. We'll start looking at this top half. First, the sun that she describes as a pulsing red disc. And I just love how thickly painted it is here. You can kind of see it pulsing above. The texture of the sun actually rises above and is thicker than the paint of the canvas behind it or underneath it. And then moving over to the top right side of the painting, this is something that's so challenging to capture in reproduction. And as we were looking at it as a potential acquisition, I was really hoping that this would be the case, that in real life, right, standing in front of it, this subtle area of the sky with the snow has a really kind of shimmering, nuanced effect to it when you stand in front of it in person. And I hope that this detail can sort of capture that in the wild variety of color that you see just in this tiny patch. Maybe this is 15 or 20 centimeters here that we're looking at in this area. And the nuance of the color is just really remarkable. And the way that these dots of snow are applied on top of it give it a really shimmering effect. It's wonderfully rewarding in passages like this to stand in front of the painting and see how it kind of unfolds as your eyes adjust with time. The reflection in the water is also wonderfully subtle. I love that this is the part now we're on the bottom left, and so it's reflecting the sun, and so there's this kind of warmth to the reflection in the water. And here's that green that she refers to in the passage. There's really a kind of purple green reflection in the water. And then here are the sails. In person, especially if you kind of lean to the side and allow the light to kind of bounce off of the surface of the canvas, you can see how thickly painted the sails are. They're worked and reworked, layer upon layer of oil paint added on top. And that kind of reminds me of the cataract of ice that she describes rushing down, or the fringe of icicles. These extremely thick sails have a texture that feels quite evocative of the passage that she describes. We can also see the many different ways that she applies snow, either kind of with these dots or dabs of paint, but also kind of with the idea of it being a perhaps springtime storm. She has more wet drops, like these dashes. And I think that it's very likely that she actually took the butt of her brush, the backside, the wooden side of her brush, in order to kind of incise these lines into the surface of the thickly worked oil on the canvas. So perhaps there's like a little bit of white or light paint on the end of the brush that she then slashes really through the painting that she's done. And so that's just an incredibly visceral way of thinking about her working process and how she's approaching her relationship with this canvas and how she's applying paint to its surface. And then lastly, this is the iceberg, or perhaps the land in the bottom left corner, where, again, thinking of the visceral way she's working with paint, she's actually applied this with a palette knife. So despite working with such a kind of literally blunt, well, not blunt, but sharp, but flat instrument that's not subtle at all, she has these an incredible range of color nonetheless. There's the gray and this sort of rosy mauve, some kind of yellowish white over here. And so she's achieving, even though she's using a palette knife, she's achieving an incredible spectrum of color in her white snow. So from there, I want to talk a little bit more, kind of zoom out to discuss Boberg and her exhibitions in her lifetime. Boberg had an international reputation. She was actually considered the representative of Swedish art in North America during her lifetime. There are fantastic newspaper articles in the New York Times and the Boston Globe that you can pull out still today and read about her reception. They kind of excitedly announced that Boberg's paintings, for example, are going to arrive in New York soon. And the Boston Globe has a title that kind of proffers, "Is she Sweden's greatest artist?" And so her reputation began kind of building on the global stage with a solo show in Paris in 1905. And then she had her own pavilion at the Venice Biennale in 1907, and she received glowing reviews from critics in both of those cities. And it was shortly after that that her work came to North America, where it was so eagerly anticipated by critics in the press that we can still read today. Then importantly, perhaps for a connection with Canadian art history, in 1912 to 1913, there was a traveling exhibition called Contemporary Scandinavian Art that brought together about 40 artists from across Scandinavia and traveled the exhibition from New York to Buffalo and several other cities across the United States. And out of these 40 or so artists, there was only one woman represented, and that was Anna Boberg. And she was represented with 7 canvases. It's possible, but not yet fully confirmed, that this very painting was one of those canvases shown at the 1912 to 13 Contemporary Scandinavian exhibition. And one of the kind of exciting links to Canadian art history there is that Lauren Harris and J.E.H. MacDonald actually crossed the border from Ontario to Buffalo, and they saw the exhibition in Buffalo. So it's possible that they would have seen this canvas itself, and if not this particular canvas, they would have seen 7 works by Anna Boberg. And this exhibition is one of the links between Scandinavian and Canadian art history. There's really wonderful resonances between the art history of these two regions, and that kind of historiographical, the writing of art history, that historical link is one of the key ones. But perhaps even more broadly, and maybe also more importantly, another central relationship between Scandinavia and Canada is, of course, their shared Arctic regions. And so it's exciting that this painting allows us to bring in a lot of the same conversations happening in Canadian art history to the continental European context. So, for example, with the Sami people, they are the indigenous peoples of this region. Anna Boberg would have interacted with them. We know that she wears the boots that she was wearing in the photograph of her that I showed earlier were created by the Sami people. And so she would have interacted with them, and yet they never appear in her paintings. And that frequently happens as well with the group of 7 artists in Canadian art history, where they paint Arctic landscapes, but erase the presence of indigenous peoples. And so by bringing the Arctic regions of Europe into the AGO's collection, we're able to make an important bridge to these very same conversations happening around land and landscape in Canadian painting. We also have the Thompson collection of ship models. And so it's kind of wonderful to have such a powerful painting of a ship on view in the European galleries. And I also love that not only is this a painting by a woman, but it's absolutely not a subject that you would expect to be by a woman. If you're standing in the galleries, you wouldn't kind of say like, oh, that one's probably by a woman. I'm happy to say that that's frequently not an easy guess to make. But it's a subject, it's a landscape, it's a kind of treacherous landscape that she's painting, even though it's also a tourist destination. But it was the result of Boberg's hard fought and well accommodated by her familial situation, as well as her independent wealth, that she was able to be so independent in the subjects that she painted, in the places that she went. And so I think that's quite an important aspect of this painting, and one of the things that makes it really exciting, that in its subject, in its style, and also in the way that Boberg lived her life, this painting and the artist defies expectations. And that's exactly where we want to be when we're thinking about how we're expanding the AGO collection and how we're telling stories. And so with that, I will wrap it up, and I hope that you will come to see the painting. It is on view in the 19th Century European Gallery called Fudger Gallery on level 1 at the AGO. Thank you so much for listening today.